We can all recall our childhood friendships with fondness, and it's not unusual for girls to continue to deepen their friendships into high school and college. But in mid to late adolescence, boys turn away from platonic intimacy and most never rediscover that level of friendship. Surface level conversations and sporadic interactions permanently replace deep conversations and brotherhood. My next guest is a developmental psychologist with a focus on adolescent friendship. She's studied the human connection for over 35 years, and today she's going to give insight into what makes childhood boy friendships easy, but adult male friendships hard, and leave us with some actionable steps for lifelong connection. Author, social advocate, connection campaigner, Dr. Niobe Way. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really delighted to have this conversation. Thank you.
Me too. I think it's an important one. So I want to start at the starting point. Depression and loneliness. Are those really the roots of the problem?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you started there because essentially what I've learned, I'm a developmental psychologist, which means I've been doing research with kids. When I do research with kids, I follow them over time. So the story I'm going to tell you, and I'll answer your question, I promise, but I'm going to tell you quickly, very quickly, where I'm getting my data from. So what I'm about to say is what I've learned from listening to boys in particular. And I listen to them starting when they're about 11 or 12, and I follow them until they're about 17 or 18. So I get to hear their stories that they tell as they go through adolescence. And they tell us a story that, and this is the interesting thing, not just about them, but about everybody else. So they tell us a story about us that's really important that I want to share today to answer your question. So what boys essentially teach us, and I've been listening to boys since 1988, so a long time, is that essentially depression and loneliness is a symptom of the problem, not the problem. And that what they teach us is actually the problem is what I call a crisis of connection. So where people are increasingly disconnected from themselves and each other, you see it in all sorts of ways. Certainly the most obvious is the high levels of loneliness at this point. But you also see it in symptoms of depression and anxiety, which is a sort of deep disconnection from the self. And that's gotten worse over time. And boys teach us that they particularly go through this crisis of connection during adolescence, where they start off having these deep, intimate, emotionally intimate friendships with boys in early adolescence, or wanting those friendships. And then as they get older, they start to feel pressures to man up, to mature. I would like to talk about how maturity is partly to blame too, the notion of how we define maturity. They start to feel the pressure to do things on their own, not share their feelings, not be emotionally connected to other guys, because we see that as we sexualize it and call it girly and gay in our culture. And so boys actually start to disconnect from what they want the most, which is deep friendships. And so you see depression, you see suicidal tendencies for boys who commit suicide, unfortunately, during adolescence. Oftentimes the root of it is this crisis of connection. And I just want to throw in one more point as it relates to it. As long as we keep on seeing the problem as a problem of mental health or depression or anxiety, we really miss the boat. Because then our solutions end up tending to just be, how do you get someone to feel less depressed? How do you get someone to feel less anxious? And a lot of the strategies can be helpful. Some of them, it varies in their effectiveness, but it usually ranges from medication to therapy, and both of those things can be helpful. However, we really miss the boat because almost always at the root of depression and anxiety, almost always, not always, but almost always, at the root of depression, anxiety, loneliness, etc., is a deep sense of being disconnected from ourselves and each other. And so and that's basically depressing. And we also, which we'll get into, I'm sure, we live in a culture that doesn't value human connection. So it makes it even harder to have those connections when we live in modern culture that basically doesn't value the very thing we need, which is deep human connection.
Well, and the two things that you said were common remedies, therapy and medication, those are solo activities. I mean, the therapist is there, but really
Exactly.
you're not friends with the therapist, like
Exactly.
he or she is listening to you, and you're connected in that way because you feel seen, but
That's right.
they're solo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to make very clear to your audience that I'm not dissing therapy and medication. They can be very, very effective in terms of addressing the immediate problem and making you feel better. And therapy can actually get to the deep roots at times. But in terms of really solving the problem, not just addressing the symptom, it's really important to see depression as a reflection of what it means to live in a culture that doesn't value human connection. And particularly for boys and men, young men, and we can talk about that, but that really doesn't value that as a core, human capacity that needs to be nurtured throughout our lives. Throughout our lives. So the idea is if we don't nurture it, we start to struggle mentally. And some of us really start to struggle, and a therapist can be very helpful in that struggle. But in terms of really helping you come out of your depression, you need the deep human connection in a community.
Well, I heard someone say something about that everyone is frustrated within many of their relationships because they are basically just taking turns talking and no one's really listening to each other. Yeah. You've talked about the importance of listening with curiosity. Can you expand on that? Why is that important to have not just humans, be physically near one another, but actually connect?
Yeah. And I want to take that question on as a developmental psychologist rather than just simply as someone who listens and thinks about humans. So what you learn about from developmental psychology is when you listen to children and young people and babies and toddlers, you learn that we come into the world with extraordinary, what I call relational intelligence. And how I define relational intelligence is the concept of the capacity to listen with curiosity. So when you listen to your 4, 5, 6-year-old, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. The incessant questions, it actually usually can start as young as 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The incessant questions are sort of, at times they can feel overwhelming as a parent. But what it suggests is that we come into the world deeply, deeply curious. And curious not just about the larger world, but actually about each other. So we ask questions like about emotions. Why my son asked when he was 5, "Mommy, why do you smile when you're feeling sad?" Oh. So he was asking literally, "Why do you fake an emotion?" Which is such a profound question at 5. Another 5-year-old said, in one of the studies we did, "Mommy, are you yelling at me because your mommy yelled at you?" And so even at 5 years old, we understand the beautiful complexity of human relationships and intergenerational and how things carry on intergenerationally. So the idea is that we come into the world very intelligent. And then what happens as we get older is we don't encourage those qualities. We don't encourage the sort of natural capacities we have and the natural desire we have to have friendships. So you also hear this deep longing for these intimate connections among boys and girls. And so we start off in that space. And we actually start off knowing how to listen, is my point. When we enter a culture that doesn't listen, that doesn't value listening, that doesn't value curiosity, that doesn't value connection, it doesn't value any of these qualities. So what happens is that we start not doing it. It's, we need to practice the muscle of curiosity, practice the muscle of connection, of knowing how to connect, and we just don't do it. So what happens is what you're alluding to, which is absolutely right, which is we end up doing a parallel play kind of thing where we're talking, but we're not talking with each other, we're talking at each other, and we're basically just waiting for our turn to talk, or waiting for someone else to affirm our opinion. But we no, seriously, it's not listening, actually. It's not listening to see, what can I learn from this person about that person? But also, what can I learn about myself and the world through listening to that person's experience? And so what can I learn?
Can you say that again? Because that was really good.
Yeah, it's basically really important. When we listen with curiosity, we're not just learning about the details about you, meaning that you were raised by, I'm making this up, you were raised by a single mom and you grew up in a certain state in the United States, et cetera. I mean, that's sort of information about you. We are learning about you when we ask questions and listen with curiosity. But we're not just learning about you. We're learning when we ask about your experiences, like, tell me about a time, Meredith, that you felt listened to. And you start talking about a time in which you felt listened to. I actually learn about what it means to be listened to through your experiences, but also I'm immediately interested in actually comparing my experience to yours. So then what happens is I actually learn more about what I feel and how I feel listened to when I feel listened to. So we learn about the other person, but we really also learn about ourselves through listening with curiosity. And we learn about how the world works through listening with curiosity to other people. And that part is really absent in our adult relationships, that notion of, and this is so profound to me because I love your podcast for this reason. Um, it's actually learning something that you didn't know about yourself, oftentimes through listening to another person, and that creates a connection. Because I promise you, when you actually learn something new about yourself from someone else, you feel a sense of connection that's deep and profound. They taught you something about yourself, and I just can't even underscore that enough. How much that is so meaningful in a connection.
That innate childlike curiosity is completely undervalued.
Exactly.
I suspect too that there's like a, I don't know, don't be impolite. Like there's a societal thing too, because I remember the story that you told, I think it was in your book or maybe it was in an interview where you were doing a study with a classroom of kids and they were asking you about your ex-husband.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
they were
you want me
like,
to tell that story?
yeah, tell that story because
Okay.
I think, I don't know, because I think it illustrates like how children are uninhibited and
Yeah.
they have those listening skills and they're not completely afraid to break some societal rule of, you know, don't ask personal questions. And so
Exactly.
they almost stumble into deeper connections, whereas we are stumbling out of them.
Yeah, I mean, so the obvious example, and I'll tell the story, but I'll give it a little bit of context. So I teach a method. I started off teaching a method at NYU to doctoral students who are doing their doctoral training, a research method I called transformative interviewing. We eventually, with my colleague Joseph Nelson, turned it into a method that we actually teach to middle and high school students, called the Listening Project, and we're now in multiple high schools and middle schools around New York City. And I have a whole team doing this in school now. And what we're learning is that actually, when you listen to kids and you ask them about their questions that they have, that they wish they would ask, and that they want to ask each other, and that they ask us when they do their practice interviews with us in the classroom, you really discover how much we've lost our curiosity. So now I'll give the example. So when you ask seventh graders, I was in a room full of seventh graders. These are seventh grade boys at an all boys school in the Lower East Side in New York. And that's 12 years old, for those of you who don't know. And I said, you can ask me any question you want. Everything's fair game. And if I don't want to answer, I'll just say I don't want to answer, but ask me anything you want to ask me. So they started off with a question about, are you married? And so I said no. And at the time I wasn't. And then they began to say, well, okay. And then like 2 seconds later, after they realized I was divorced, the very first question that, you have to imagine a 12-year-old boy asking this. He said, do you still love your ex-husband? And then the questions became from other boys when I responded honestly. And the key is when someone asks you, listening with curiosity, you have to respond with honesty. Because if you don't, that curiosity will stop. The curiosity is nurtured by you answering honestly. So I answered honestly. And then the other boys started chiming in things like, do you think he knows that you still love him? Do you think that your kids know that? How do they know that? I mean, we had a 40-minute conversation. I'm not exaggerating. 40-minute conversation with a room full of 24, 12-year-old boys talking about love and talking about the ambiguities of love, the nuance of love, how people know that, there's still love in a relationship. And this is it was just stunning. And I've had so many conversations with young people where their questions are just deep and profound, including boys from all different cultural backgrounds, really engaging in these very thick questions. When you ask doctoral students, about their questions and you get them to interview me or one of the trainers, Their questions are always obviously looking to ask the smart question,
Yeah.
the good question. So they want to ask me some complicated theoretical question, about, how do I make sense of macro structures in society? And I don't mind answering that question within a certain context, but they're so afraid of actually asking real questions, what I call questions that come from the heart, that come from sort of really trying to understand the world in front of us. And so the idea is that when we're younger, we're more connected to our natural curiosity. And so the question is, how do we begin to then, it's not teaching curiosity. We don't need to teach it. We just need to nourish it. So we have the natural capacity and now we need to nourish it.
Oh, that gives me goosebumps. Because that's what I want to do here is nourish curiosity. If you can hear conversations where there's some curiosity, I feel like that's a good start. So in terms of adolescence, is it chicken or egg? Like, is the adolescence causing the depletion of the intimate relationships and the ability to or desire to have them? Or is it society? Yeah. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I do. In some ways, I want to reframe the question because this is how the culture reframes it. Is it the individual's fault or is it the culture's fault?
Oh,
and I would say it's in some ways it's both, but I'm going to put more blame, like we blame the parents more than the kid. I'm going to put more blame on the culture because ultimately, fundamentally, we live in a culture in which we live in a culture that clashes with our nature. So we have a culture that values the me over the we, the self over relationships, independence over interdependence, stoicism over vulnerability, and ultimately the hard over the soft. And when you live in a society that values the hard over the soft, lots of people suffer because we are half hard and half soft. All of us are, regardless of our gender identities and our sexual identities. All of us have a hard side and a soft side. And like a yin and a yang, we need both our soft and hard side to function. So if you make maturity, that's that word I wanted to go back to. If you make maturity only about self-sufficiency or only about, being independent, and you don't also include the capacity to have mutually supportive relationships, people suffer from that. Because ultimately, as we all know as grown-ups, maturity is absolutely about being able to do that give and take in relationships as well as being independent. It's not just being independent. So if you live in a culture that defines maturity as the hard over the soft and then masculinity as the hard over the soft, you get deeply, deeply troubled people.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we are born in the world in relationship. We thrive in relationship and we spend most of our lives, if not our entire lives, looking for deep connection with other people. And what deep means different things for different people. So it doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, but we're looking for that kind of meaningful connection, whatever that means to us. So the idea is when adolescence, the reason why it always happens in adolescence, you see this loss in adolescence, is because that's the very age that they're expected to essentially grow up, become a man. And then for girls, because it does affect girls too, become a woman, right? Become mature, become someone who could potentially be a mother, right? And be responsible for other people, which for girls and women, that means actually self-sacrificing, right?
Yeah.
Not their own needs met. So men and women struggle with different issues in some ways, but in some ways they struggle with the exact same issue, which is that we're really not valuing the soft parts of ourselves. And so girls don't value the soft parts of themselves. And certainly boys and men don't value the soft parts of themselves. And that gets in the way. And then I just want to add one more thing. Where I put individual responsibility, and I would put individual responsibility in this too, is because we ultimately, Meredith, and this is the kicker for me, we do have a choice. We do have a choice of what we nurture, right? We do have a choice. It's not like we're somehow forced to only nourish the hard side of ourselves. We actually have a choice. So when we make the choice to privilege academic achievement over kindness, or did you do your homework is your question to your kids, rather than, what'd you do fun with your friends today? What was fun today that you experienced with your friends? Or did you meet anybody that you really liked today? I mean, just all those questions that we could be asking of our children, but we end up saying, especially when they're teenagers, did you do your homework? That's a choice we're making, to communicate to our children that what we really care is whether they did their homework, and their relationships, we don't care so much, unless those kids are getting them to do bad things. We only care when they do, when there's peer pressure to do negative things. So I do want to put some of the responsibility on individuals, but I wouldn't put it on the kids necessarily. I'd put it on the parents and the educators and the people around them that are fostering this kind of disconnected sense of humanity, where it's only the hard sides of ourselves that matter.
Okay, so that reminds me of a study that you quoted in another interview about how some parents were surveyed, and 80% of them said that they valued academic performance over kindness, which is alarming on so many levels. But the question that I have connected to that is, I don't think parents want necessarily to purposefully do that. So how can parents encourage what you're calling relational intelligence in their kids? What can they do to support their kids in that journey, whether they're, 11 or 12, or they're already 16, 17?
Yeah. So the very first thing that I always say to everybody, regardless if you're a parent or not, it doesn't matter. This is the very first thing we need to do is normalize the desire for meaningful connection. That's not a girly thing, that's not a gay thing, that it's it is a girly and gay thing, but it's also a human thing, right? It's a human thing that you see in, regardless of identity, regardless of gender identity, sexual identity, you see in all humans. We all want deep human connection.
All mammals. Mammals are like that.
Exactly. Mammals are that. And then you also see that, of course, in non-mammal. I mean, you see it in the animal world.
Is that the security system? What is she even saying?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay.
we're going in the other room. Okay. Anyway, so the first of all, so you have to normalize it. And so, okay. Okay. So you have to normalize it in the sense of, we're not valuing it. So boys think that, for example, boys and young men think it's weird. And they've told me that repeatedly, that it's weird to actually want close friendships. And especially as they become young men, they think it makes them somehow different. And so I've had so many young men say to me, I just didn't know it was normal. I just didn't know that kind of desire was normal. I thought it was just me. I mean, I've had so many boys and young men say that.
So do you think that's the parents, like the dads, or even the moms and the dads? Do you think it's partially because the kid is not seeing the mom or the dad spend time with their friends? Like, is that part of it?
Yeah. It's, it's funny. Where does that come from? I mean, it comes from everywhere. It comes from social media. I mean, it comes from movies, that friendships between men and movies is almost always, if it exists, it's sort of bromance. It's sort of a kind of macho connection around drinking and, doing something macho together. I mean, you very rarely see movies, and I have to talk about a movie actually that just came out that is based on my book, Deep Secrets. But you very rarely see emotionally intimate friendships between men. I mean, we really do. We get it everywhere, that somehow your desire for human connection somehow makes you different. And that is just the strangest thing in the world, because all we do as humans is want that. So the very first thing is we have to normalize it. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about the importance of friendships. You allude to something that I think is super important, which is we have to show that friendships are important in our own lives. And even if we struggle to have our own friendships as parents and as grown-ups, we have to talk about that struggle, because I think it's a struggle for many of us to find meaningful relationships and friendships. So we have to make it normal. We have to talk about it, that it's relevant for us and it's relevant for them. And then the second thing is what you keep on alluding to, but I think it's super important, is it's not just the importance of friendships, but actually that it takes real skill to have them. So, figuring out, how do you listen with curiosity so that you come to know somebody else well? How do you work through conflict? How do you listen with curiosity when you're mad at somebody? How do they, how can you encourage so that if there's a conflict in the friendship, which there almost always is in deep, meaningful friendships, someone has hurt the other person's feelings, something happens, and listening with curiosity in a way of, why did you do that? Or what made you think that I meant that? Or, whatever the question is, but that comes from a genuine place of curiosity, not judgment, that actually helps repair a conflict. It helps each person feel listened to. So the whole thing is that it's not just valuing friendships, although that's the first step. But the second step is understanding, just like any other complicated task we do in our lives, building healthy relationships is work. It takes a kind of patience. It takes a kind of self-reflection. It takes the skill to be able to follow a conversation with, following the logic of somebody else's responses and trying to hook right into that logic to understand their experiences. So it's actually a fairly sophisticated skill that needs to be nourished throughout your life. So I would say those two things, fundamental, I'll repeat them again so people are very clear. Make it normal that we all come into the world wanting deep connection. We spend the rest of our lives looking for deep connection or savoring it when we have it. And the second thing is that it takes real skill. And we need, as grown-ups with kids and also with other grown-ups, with our partners, et cetera, our family, we need to help nourish those basic skills by nurturing the capacity to listen with curiosity.
I think there is a temptation for grown-ups. I love that word. It sounds so silly to say for grown-ups. It's like you would say grown-ups and going to the potty. It's just like, maybe we shouldn't use those words, but here we are. I'm going to say it. I think
I like the word, because in some sense, I would argue that what we call grown-ups, we could learn a lot from people who are not grown up.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I like the emphasis that we think because we're grown up, we're smarter. But the reality is, what I've learned in my career is that, in fact, it's listening to young people that allowed me to see how much I actually used to be more grown up. I used to be, No, really. I used to really ask questions, want to know the answer, know how to connect to somebody, know how to make someone feel good, really care about that, really care, and that's what I was when I was younger. And then I grew up, and you start to get the message that somehow to deeply care, or you can care too much, or you can be overly sensitive. I always tell my students there's no such thing as being overly sensitive. And most women are accused of that. And then men who are accused of being sensitive are then seen as somehow they must not be straight, or it's bizarre things we do to humans. And I'll say it very simply, that we take what is human and we gender it and we give it a sexual identity. And then we wonder why many of us struggle. You can't take what is fundamentally human and give it a gender identity and a sexual identity and think we're going to all grow up thriving.
That is so true. That's so true.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so true.
Just about it. And also remember, it's on a hierarchy.
Yeah.
So the soft qualities that girls and women and gay guys get, sort of clumped together is not valued. So it's not only that you're raised to be half human, only valuing one side of yourself, but we don't value that beautiful side to yourself that actually allows you to make the connection, which is your own vulnerability and your capacity to ask questions. And that's so stunning to me. What kind of culture is this? It's really, go ahead.
I want to, when talking about culture, what I was going to say about the grown-ups, I think it's tempting for grown-ups to think like, okay, this is just a part of the maturation process. But you did studies in read data or something in other countries, and this is kind of like an American phenomenon, right? Where in adolescence, the kids turn away from these relationships, as opposed to other countries, they continue to show signs of affection and platonic intimacy.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing. about 10 years ago when my book Deep Secrets came out, I thought it was exclusively American phenomenon, what I was talking about.
Okay.
The pattern of moving away from their parents is distinctly American. But what's happening around the world, which is just strange to me, is that America's sort of values, both in a good sense and a bad sense, are being globalized. So, and you see that, for example, in most countries around the world, two boys having close friendship was never conceived as gay. I mean, you would see boys being very, very intimate and men being very intimate in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe. I mean, you'd see all sorts of examples in African countries of where men showed physical intimacy with each other, and it was never sexualized. It was really with the introduction of American homophobia that introduces the notion that somehow that's other, which in our homophobic society, that's gay. And so the idea is that's an American phenomenon. That's an American export. And so you get this movie that I was alluding to called Close, that is based in Belgium, actually. It was made by a Belgian film director. And it's up for an Academy Award, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And it tells the story of boys actually having friendships, and then the way in which the mocking of their friendship basically destroys both boys, and then creates the problem. And that's the story very much told in my book as well. So, the part that is American, but again, it gets exported, unfortunately, is not only the homophobia, but also, as you're alluding to, the sense that somehow the point of growing up is separation. The point of what the work you should be doing is exclusively about separating from your parents, separating from your family, and becoming independent. That is a distinctly American story. It's a cowboy story, right? It's that sort of lone cowboy story.
Yeah.
That's very American, but that is also being exported. So you're starting to see in China, I've spent many years living in China, and I know that context very well. You're starting to see those kinds of notions of masculinity in China. You're starting to see them in Europe. You're starting to see them in all sorts of, the Middle East, all sorts of places. You're starting to see this weird infiltration of what's being defined as modernity, but it's really just American masculinity that's coming into the culture and then making it very, very hard for people to form close relationships. Because if you're supposed to separate, and it's weird to stay close to your mother or your father, that's going to be seriously getting in your way of being able to build healthy relationships, because your relationship with your mom and your dad, if you have close relationships, helps you build the skills of close relationships. So we need our moms and dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and we need all those people in our lives to help us figure out just the challenges of friendships and the joys, absolutely the joys. But I never want to make it sort of romantic about friendships are beautiful things always, because sometimes they're actually not. Sometimes they're very painful. But that's part of the process, just like any marriage as well.
Interesting. That's very true. I'm inspired to grow down now instead of grow up.
I
want to switch. I want to switch gears a little bit. You talk in your book about the rising suicide rates among adolescent boys, the overlap of this separation, friend divorce, if you will, from the people that the kids are close to, and how it's connected to those suicide rates. I hadn't heard that. I wasn't aware of that. What I have always been aware of is the shootings, and how that's almost always that age of a child, usually boys. Can you talk a little bit about that connection? Because I think I have a hard time knowing or understanding definitively that that's a connection crisis, although I can infer that it probably is. But the killer almost always kills themselves. So it's like, you can't talk to them, so how can we come to that conclusion? What can you share about that?
Well, this is the interesting thing. So in the literature on trauma, and there's a lot of people who write about trauma, and something called moral trauma, which is an interesting concept introduced by a psychiatrist named Jonathan Shea. And it's about the trauma we experience when those in authority tell us to do things that we know is not right morally. And so what he says in his work on moral injury is that people who are traumatized actually have a compulsion to let the public know of their story. And that's part of their trying to understand it. And so what you see with mass shooters, and as well as many people who are now young people who are committing suicide, unfortunately, is that they're making actually their stories very public. I mean, they may have killed themselves in the process, but they're writing manifestos, their social media postings tell the whole story. They want people to know why they're angry, and they want people to know why they're, wanting to get revenge. And so we never ask that question. We just think they're angry, mentally ill people, especially the mass shooters. And I'm not challenging, they are mentally ill, right? People who often do want to get to revenge. But the question we have to ask is, they weren't born that way. So how did they arrive at that place that they, sounds like from their manifestos, that they basically have a mental health break, and then they become sort of out to prove to everybody that they're worthwhile and nobody else deserves to live, and et cetera, et cetera. So the question that what you hear in these social media postings, as well as the manifestos, is you hear these stories about isolation. You hear lots of stories about bullying. You hear lots of stories about where they, from their perception at least, they're being blamed for their own problems rather than a context that sort of, as they perceive it, doesn't care. Oftentimes the parents actually do care, and they're trying very, very hard to get their son, because it's almost always their son, the attention they need, whether it's the mental health attention or there's something that, they know their son is struggling. But the larger context basically pathologizes many of these boys for various different reasons. I mean, it goes as extreme as, if someone's on the spectrum or someone's not socially skilled, they get isolated and seen as a so-called loner. There's no such thing as a loner, by the way. All humans need human connection. And so to make them into loners where we sort of ignore them, and then we wonder why, 5 or 6 or 7 years later, they have basically a breakdown. And then they become violent towards themselves and sometimes towards others. And we know in the research, and I have to always be nerdy and go back to the research. So we know in the research that when humans are put in isolation, and we also know, so solitary confinement, for example, but also from the non-human animal studies, that when non-human animals as well as human animals are isolated, the impact is oftentimes aggression. So in a mice study, if you isolate mice, and you may think, well, how can you make the equation between mice and humans? You can't, but you see a similar pattern. When you isolate mice, extreme isolation, and then you put in another mouse into the maze, right, to see how they respond, they oftentimes attack that mouse. Meaning isolation can literally lead to a kind of incredible aggression.
Interesting.
And so you're basically seeing that with the mass shooters. They feel incredibly isolated, incredibly victimized. Whether they truly are, to what extent, who knows? But that's the way they perceive it. And what gets them most angry is that nobody seems to care. And so there's, except possibly their mom or possibly somebody in their lives that do. But the general context, they don't feel like cares about what's happening to them, and that builds their rage. And then, right, there's like a break that you hear in their narratives. So the question is, again, if we raise our children to go against their nature, right, because that's what we're doing now. We're raising our children to go against their nature. Their nature is social. Their nature is needing that social connection, needing those bonds from all sorts of people, not just from a peer, but also from their family, from all sorts of people. If we're raising our children to not value those connections, why do we keep on getting surprised that there's consequences to that? That include, and not always, but include violence, right? That there's going to be violent consequences to raising social animals asocially, right? There's just going to be consequences.
Yeah.
And so violence and suicide and mental health problems and loneliness and isolation and sexual assault and all those problems we get of hate really fundamentally are that we're raising our children to go against their nature, and that's getting in the way. So the solution, to sort of jump on the solution, which I think is in part, and that's listening with curiosity, but it's also seeing that it's a cultural problem. It's not an individual problem. It's not the problem of boys and men. It's not the problem of girls and women. It's not the problem of all the groups we blame. It's not the problem of Trump supporters or Biden supporters, right? I mean, basically, the problems are not a group of people.
Yeah.
It's the way we've constructed our culture so that caring is on the bottom and making a lot of money is on the top.
Yeah. Like friendship is an accessory and not, the
Exactly.
main thing.
Exactly.
I
Exactly. Go
want
ahead.
to ask you, I know we're running out of time, which is tragic, but you've talked about what parents can do to kind of rearrange those priorities so that
Yeah.
their caring and connection are at the top.
Yeah.
As a wife and a sister, I think it's so tempting for us ladies to, call up our husbands and our brothers and be like, listen, you need to hang out with other dudes, okay? It's really important. I talked to this lady and she knows
Yeah.
stuff and she's smart. I'm guessing that's probably not the right approach. So outside of parental care, what can we as wives and sisters, and even just like female friends of men, do to support them?
I mean, again, it goes back to that thing I was saying before. We have to know as women, right, in relationship with men, that their relationships outside of their relationship with us is fundamental to their relationship to us, right?
Mm.
So if we
Hmm.
think about, and I always say this for those in marital therapy or wanting to go into marriage therapy, one of the best things you can do, not the best thing, that's a little too simplistic, but one of the best things you can do if you're struggling in your marriage is to actually, both of you, develop relationships, friendships outside of the marriage. Because it is not normal, if you want to talk about what's not normal, that we are social animals. The fact that we think the one person could be our end all be all and carry everything we have to offer in one person, that's not normal. That's not normal. And so the idea is that, unfortunately, I think women and sisters and, many of us wives, et cetera, we don't really believe that. We somehow believe that we should be able to be our partner's sole person. And at some level, just like they can't be, I mean, I always say this and women always laugh. Imagine you only had your husband to talk to about your problems with your husband.
Sweet
Like
Jesus.
that. Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
what all women say. But men feel the same way. They just don't know how to articulate because they don't know what the problem is here.
Right.
But the idea is that you have to develop a range of relationships so that we have to nurture that in ourselves. So we should be hanging out also with our girlfriends, to nurture that part of ourselves, as well as encouraging our husbands to have their own friendships, not just the husband of our girlfriends, right?
Yes.
Right. But their own friendship, that they're making it work and that we give them time. I know even marriages where, the guy and the woman will go on separate mini vacations with their friends, apart from each other. And I think that's so healthy. It's just so healthy. And so I would say, number one, just like I said, normalize it for our kids. I would say normalize it in your relationship. Just make it that healthy humans have many, many different types of relationships with many different types of people, that we're born that way. It's in
Yeah.
our evolution. That's how we evolved to be a successful species, is we have many multiple relationships. And how did we get here, Meredith, that we got here where it's just one person? I mean, it's so weird.
It's so bizarre. And I
So
think we've solved the world's problems today, Dr. Way.
yes,
I think we can clock out now.
exactly.
Can you, before we sign off, can you tell people where to find your book, but also the new book that's coming out?
Yes. Yeah. So the book that I'm mostly referencing when I talk about the data is a book called Deep Secrets, Boys, Friendships, and the Crisis of Connection. You can get it on, the internet and Amazon, et cetera. And the new book that I also wrote, a book called The Crisis of Connection, which for practitioners may be quite interesting. And it has practitioners and they're talking about how they're addressing the crisis of connection in their own work. So that's The Crisis of Connection. And then the third book that I just finished is called Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. And that won't be out for a while, but that really tells the story of what we've learned from listening to boys about ourselves and our culture, and how we can begin to create a culture that better nourishes our nature.
I love it. Thank you so much. This has been a really nourishing conversation.
Wonderful. Well, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, you're still here. That's awesome. I hope to see you next week too. I talk with the most interesting people that you've probably never heard of. Most of them are paradoxical and bring an opportunity for you to grow as a person. So if you like bright, meaningful entertainment, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications.